Well, we finally have a deal. Or at least a deal. But the reporting on the agreement between Israel and Hamas to end-ish the Gaza war tends to fail to actually explain why we just got here now, and not 6 months ago or 6 years from now. Remember, war is bargaining failure, and the fighting needs to do something to resolve it. So let's get out our lines on maps and try to get to the bottom of this, because we have quite a few possibilities to cover. Post-hostage release credibility problems, Israeli recognition of the difficulty of trying to completely eradicate Hamas, Hamas's satisfaction that Israeli diplomatic breakthroughs with other countries became infeasible, and finally, US presidential politics, with a gentle reminder that sometimes it can be a combination of things. But we begin with a quick description of what specifically is happening. There are 3 phases to the deal that has been reached. Phase 1 of the plan is a 6-week ceasefire that calls for Hamas to release 33 Israeli hostages. In return, Israel will release several hundred Palestinian prisoners, and additionally, Israel will begin a slow withdrawal process. Phase 2 is another 6-week period, and I interrupt this fun discussion with a friendly reminder that everything in international relations is subject to change without notice whenever one side decides that it is just not interested in playing along anymore. Anyway, that second phase features more hostage releases, more prisoner releases, and more withdrawals. The final stage, subject to that same reminder, and an additional warning that we may be here in a couple of months trying to understand why it all fell apart, heck, they're doing a good job of it already, is an ongoing cessation of active hostilities, with final hostage releases, final prisoner releases, and a reconstruction process for the Gaza Strip. Cool. The thing is, all of that was feasible months ago, and that is the central puzzle of war. Take whatever the expected outcome of war is, and just implement it right now. No one else has to die, and there need not be any more economic destruction. And as all my lines on mapsomaniacs know, the presence of those costs, converted to the value of what is being fought over, actually creates a range of settlements that are mutually preferable to war. So, if you want to explain why a war happened, you need to explain why the actors chose to fight, instead of implementing one of those more efficient solutions. And, equivalently, if you want to explain why wars end, you need to explain why the process of fighting opened up a deal that was not feasible beforehand. To try to get at that latter point with the Gaza war, let's start with a central problem with the hostages. For Israel, returning the hostages taken on October 7, 2023, was a primary objective for the conflict. So, if Hamas wanted to end the war, it needed to return all of them as a prerequisite. One slight problem. Once Israel recovered the hostages, the IDF would no longer be concerned about harming them during offensive actions, and the corresponding inability of Israel to credibly commit to a certain outcome once the hostages were returned doomed the possibility of an exchange. It is a central problem with kidnapping and hostage taking. If you were thinking about doing something like that in the future, my professional advice to you would be, just don't. But the perverse thing is that you can solve this problem by capturing and holding a bunch of opposing militants prisoner. When you swap them, Hamas gains some military power, which offsets the losses and vulnerability with Israeli hostages no longer there. From this perspective, a ceasefire had to wait until Israel accumulated enough prisoners to balance the power scales. The second possibility is that Israel learned that achieving every one of its war goals was infeasible. One notable thing about the deal is that it leaves Hamas in charge of Gaza, assuming that it can retain control with whatever political infrastructure remains there. Indeed, the World Bank estimates that there was $18.5 billion in damage, and that was a total from just the first 4 months of the war. Now, one reason why wars occur is because a party has false optimism in how successful it will be in the war. War therefore ends when the realities on the ground force it to reevaluate its beliefs. It is the principle of convergence in action. From this perspective, 15 months of fighting without completely eradicating Hamas has shown that pushing for such a goal is infeasible for Israel. And if it is any consolation to warhawks in Netanyahu's cabinet, who may have wished to see the war continue, they can take comfort in how Israel handily turned the page on the conflict with Hezbollah, and Iran also appears to be in a much worse shape. Moving back to Hamas, we may be looking at a calculation regarding geopolitical sentiment. One of the best documented original motives for the October 7th attack was concerns about Israel and Saudi Arabia normalizing relations. In fact, it is something that we have been talking about on this channel since day one. The basic idea is that Saudi Arabia and Iran have regional aspirations. Iran and Israel also do not get along, but Saudi Arabia does not feel threatened by Israel's actions in the region. Thus, they could team together to squeeze out Iran. To wit, Israel had been on a normalization tear in the years prior. Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan all signed on. So Hamas attacked to stir up anti-Israeli sentiment in the region. This forced Saudi Arabia to think twice about normalizing relations with Israel, as the government must worry about the domestic instability that may arise as a result. Basically, this is a classic preventive war scenario. It is a shift in power with extra steps. In turn, the Gaza war could end when Hamas believes that fighting for another day will not cause any significant extra delay, and when Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia will be feasible. Maybe January 19th is that day? Finally, the last possibility worth discussing is peace incentives from the United States. And I do not think that this provides a good explanation for what has happened, at least not for the most part. Pointing to the United States cheats a bit on the original premise, by ignoring the bargaining problem between Israel and Hamas, and instead having a third party enter and convince the original two to stop. Rather than using finesse and addressing the original bargaining problem, you just brute force it away. Sometimes this is done via peace subsidies, essentially third-party payments to the warring parties that are conditional on hostilities ending, as was the driving force behind the Camp David Accords. Yep, before Jimmy Carter started building Habitats for Humanity, he was bringing peace to the Middle East. It is amazing what you can do with 100 years on this planet, though he could not do everything. More on that in a minute. The other main strategy for building not houses, but rather peace, is the threat of military interventions or changes to military assistance, as is central to discussions about a US-imposed deal between Ukraine and Russia. However, that just kicks the question back a step. Why didn't the third party step in beforehand? Here, some say it is because Biden will be leaving office on Monday, and Hamas had to do it before the more pro-Israel Trump came into office. Two problems with that. One, there is not much that Biden could do that Trump could not undo on day one if he felt like it. And two, Israel is perfectly aware of this and could just hold out an extra week. Obviously, that is not what Netanyahu did, so we can eliminate that. Another perspective is that Biden somehow overpaid to ensure that the deal was done on his watch, essentially doing what Jimmy Carter was unable to do regarding the Iran hostage crisis, which literally ended in the middle of Reagan's inaugural address. Again, though, there is not much that Biden could commit the United States to that Trump could not just undo. And Trump really does not like paying for things. So Israel and Hamas would not be banking on those overpayments, realizing that they will not actually come to fruition. The pre-inauguration timing also indicates that this is not a case of Trump promising Israel a large payout for a deal. Otherwise, Trump would have forced Israel to delay the agreement so that he would get all of the credit for it. And Netanyahu would want to wait because it is more important to appease the incoming president than it is to satisfy the outgoing one. It is the same story as to why Iran waited for Reagan to be sworn in. A final perspective is that Trump was going to create stronger disincentives if the war continued, raising the desire of both Israel and Hamas to reach a deal sooner than later. The problem here is that Trump was elected more than 2 months ago, and that is a long time to wait. Maybe it took a bit for the Trump team to communicate what the new policy would be. Now, such a delay may be frustrating from an efficiency perspective, but time losses can be unavoidable when you need to coordinate with an outgoing administration. And, put together, that would help us get to a mid-January finish line. Speaking of finish lines, that takes us to the end of today's video. Did you know that I have a new video on Russia's bounty program over on the secondary channel? Or that I have a dedicated playlist about the Middle East on this channel? Regardless, if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.